Nobody remembers her name. That's the first thing you should know before you get attached to her. I've been up and down that country for 30 years. Sulphur Springs, the Dragoons, the long dry lip of the Chiricahuas, and I've watched men get statues for less than what she did with a box of her dead father's tools, and a hand that shook so bad she had to hold her own wrist to file straight. She was 19. She weighed maybe 90 pounds soaking wet, and I know that for a fact because the first time I laid eyes on her she was soaking wet, chest deep in a flood, going under after a wooden box while a wagon came apart around her like a rotten tooth. I hollered at her to let it go. She didn't even look up. I've priced everything in my life. Every horse, every hat, every night's sleep I didn't get. I have a book in my saddlebag with the cost of nearly everything a man can lose. And I have never, not once, not in 30 years of trying, been able to write down what that girl paid or what the rest of us got for free. So sit with me a while. It won't be a comfortable story. It shouldn't be. Her name was Nell Hark, and she carried her father's toolbox across the frontier. And what she built is still pumping water in that valley right now, this minute, under somebody else's name. The flood came down the wash with no more warning than a change in the smell of the air. That's the part people never believe. There'd been no rain where we stood. Sky over Bitter Sink was the color of a scalded bone, sun straight up, nothing moving but heat. But 40 miles north, in mountains we couldn't even see for the haze, something had let go, and the arroyo, which had been a dry road, a good road, the road everybody used, remembered that it was a river. I smelled it first, wet creosote, mud, that mineral smell like a mouthful of pennies. Then I heard it, and it didn't sound like water. It sounded like a freight train made out of gravel. There was a wagon in the bottom of that wash. A Studebaker farm rig, cheap, the tongue already cracked and splinted with rawhide, hitched to 2 mules who had already decided they wanted no part of this world. A man was cutting the mules loose with a knife, screaming at them, and a woman was up on the bank with a baby, and there was a girl, a small, plain, dark-headed girl in a soaked gray dress, standing in the bed of that wagon with her arms full of a wooden box. The water hit the wagon the way a fist hits a jaw. Everything went sideways. I was up on the bank with my own outfit, 6 mules, a freight wagon loaded with barbed wire and coal oil for the Merrick outfit, and a mule named Dorcas who is smarter than most men I've worked for. I remember thinking, with that awful flat clarity you get, those people are dead, and I am going to have to write it down. Because that's my sickness. I'll tell you now and get it over with. I keep a tally book, small, black, greasy, tied shut with a bootlace. In it I write down what things cost, not just money, though I do that too. Coffee, 40 cents. Hat ruined in a hail squall, $3. 2 days' work lost. I started it when I was 19 and broke, and I have never stopped, and my wife, before she died, called it a disease of the soul, and she may have been right. She's in there too. I wrote down what the doctor cost. I wrote down what the coffin cost. I wrote down the number of days. I have never been able to write down what she was worth. That's the trouble with the whole system. It doesn't work on the only things that matter, but a man keeps doing what he knows. So the wagon went over. The man with the knife came up 30 yards downstream, spitting mud, alive by pure accident, and dragged himself out. The mules made it. The woman on the bank was screaming a name. And the girl was gone under, and then she wasn't, and she had that box. She had it up out of the water, and she was trying to swim one-armed, which is to say she was drowning slowly instead of quickly, and I was off my seat and down that bank on my heels like a fool. "Let it go," I hollered. "Girl, let it go." She heard me. I know she did because she turned her face toward the sound and I saw her eyes, and there was nothing in them of the sort of panic I was expecting. She looked irritated. She looked like a woman who'd been interrupted. Then she got a foot on something under the water, a rock, the wagon, God's own thumb. I don't know, and she shoved. and I got hold of her sleeve, and the sleeve tore, and I got hold of her hair, which is an ungentlemanly way to save a person, but the flood was not consulting my manners, and I hauled the both of them out. Her and the box. She would not let go of the box. Even on the bank, gagging up brown water on her hands and knees, she kept one arm hooked through the rope handle like it was a child. I stood over her, dripping, breathing like a bellows. "That box," I said when I could, "better have God in it." She spat. She wiped her mouth with the back of her wrist. And she looked up at me, 20 years old at the outside, mud in her teeth, and said, "It's got a spirit level in it, which is close enough." Her name was Nell Hark, and the people in the wagon were not her people. That took me 2 days to sort out. She'd bought passage with them out of Deming, a family named Kessler, going to Tucson, and Kessler had taken her $4 and let her ride on the tailgate with her box, and had spent most of the trip explaining to her that a girl alone was a sin against the natural order. She rode anyway. She'd have ridden with the devil if the devil was headed west and had room for freight. I told her I was going to Bitter Sink. She said that was fine, she was going wherever there was work. I said the work at Bitter Sink was cattle and there wasn't any on account of the drought, and she said, "Then I'll go where the water is." And I laughed at her, which is a thing I would like to take back and cannot. We made a dry camp that night on the flat. I got a fire out of mesquite roots and boiled coffee that tasted like the inside of a boot. She sat on the ground with the box open in front of her, and she took every single thing out of it, and she dried each one on the hem of her dress, and she oiled them with a bit of tallow and a rag, and she put them back. It took her 3 hours. I watched her do it in the firelight, and I understood that I was seeing a prayer. The box was oak, dovetailed corners cut by hand. You could see the little tails, uneven, human. 2 coats of shellac gone to amber. A brass plate on the lid with 3 letters punched in with a hand stamp. A Hark. Inside, a set of files, from a great coarse bastard file down to a thing as fine as a nail. A brace and 8 bits. A tap and die set with 2 dies missing. Calipers. A ball-peen hammer with the handle worn to the shape of somebody's grip, not hers. Too big for hers. A scribing awl. And a spirit-level brass and mahogany with a green bubble in the glass that trembled and settled, trembled and settled. And a ledger. Canvas cover, swollen with water, which she opened very slowly and fanned out page by page to dry, and would not let me look at. "Your father," I said. "Amos Hark." She said the name the way you'd set down something breakable. Millwright, grist mills mostly, some pumps. He could make anything that turned. "Where's he at?" She turned a page. The paper made a sound like a moth. "Bloomington," she said, "under a stone that cost more than the house." I got out my tally book, and I don't know why, and I wrote, "Girl, Nell Hark, box oak, W tools and ledger cost." She saw me do it. She watched me put the book away. "What's that?" "Nothing," I said, "a habit." "Habits are just prayers you forgot the words to," she said, and went back to her pages, and I sat there feeling like I'd been slapped by somebody half my size. You have to understand what that country was in the summer of '86. Dry, I mean dry in a way that gets into your reasoning. 3 years running with less rain than a man could measure in his hat. The grass was gone. The cattle were walking skeletons that bawled all night, and you'd lie in your bedroll listening to them and think about how a cow, dying of thirst, will walk in a circle around a dry tank for 2 days before it lays down. Just walking. Around and around. Merrick, Silas Merrick, who owned Bitter Sink and about 11 miles of the valley floor and thought he owned the sky over it, had 6 wells and 5 of them were sucking sand. He had a windmill from a catalog that had thrown a vane in a gust and sat there hammering itself to death. He had 30 men hauling water in barrels from a seep in the hills, 4 hours out, 4 hours back, and by the time it got to the stock tank, half of it had slopped out and the other half was hot. And he had soldiers that year, because that was the year of Geronimo. The whole territory had gone half mad with it. 30-odd Chiricahua, men, women, and children, And I want you to hold that number in your head, 30-odd, were out in the Sierra Madre. And there were 5,000 United States soldiers and God knows how many Mexican troops and every rancher with a rifle looking for them. 5,000. For 30. Newspapers made them into a plague of demons. Men who'd never seen an Apache in their lives shot at shadows and then wrote home about it. And the ones who weren't out, the ones who'd come in, who were living at San Carlos on the flats where the government put them, in country so poor the government's own agent called it a hell, those ones were starving. Because the beef ration was short. Because the beef ration was always short, and there were men in Tucson getting rich on the difference, and everybody knew it, and nobody did a thing. I hauled freight. I didn't get involved in it. That was my policy, and I kept to it for a long time, and I want it noted in the record that keeping to it cost nothing and was therefore, by my own arithmetic, worth exactly nothing. Nell asked Merrick for work on a Tuesday. I was there. I'd come to unload the wire, and she came up the steps of that big adobe house with the box on her shoulder. She carried it on her shoulder always, one hand up on the rope, like a woman carrying water, and she set it down and said she was a millwright's daughter and she'd fix his windmill and his wells. He didn't laugh, give him that. Merrick was too cold to laugh. He looked at her the way you look at a horse you're not going to buy. He said, "I've got a smith." "Your smith set the vane on that mill with a hot rivet and no washer," Nell said. "It walked loose. It'll do it again in a month. Then it'll take the head off." That got his attention, but only about the way a fly gets your attention. He said some things about a woman's proper sphere. He said something about how his men wouldn't take orders. And then he said the thing that I have never forgotten, which was, "Little lady, I've got water problems that men with degrees can't solve." And Nell Hark said, "Then I don't imagine another man's going to help you." Merrick's mouth went white at the corners. He gave her work, laundry, $2 a week and a shed to sleep in behind the cookhouse, and I saw her carry that box into the shed and I thought, well, that's the end of that. It wasn't. Here is how you find out what a person is made of, not in the loud moment, in the 11 weeks after it. She did the laundry. She did it well, and she did it fast, and she did it with her knuckles cracked open from the lie, and never said one word about her hands, which had been a machinist's hands, and were going to ruin. And then at night, in the last hour of light, she went to the smith's shop, which the smith, a Welshman named Ivor Price, a decent enough drunk, left unlocked, and she worked. I know because I sleep light and I was camped by the corral for a month waiting on a load. I'd hear it. Little sounds, a file, the tap-tap of a punch. Once, the small clear tink of a hammer on a cold chisel, and then a long silence, and then a word from her that I will not repeat, and then the tink again. I went and looked one night, stood in the door with a lantern. She was making a valve. She had a hunk of brass off a wrecked steam whistle, and she was cutting a seat in it with a file, checking it against her father's calipers, cutting again. Her face 2 inches from the metal, sweat coming down her nose and dropping on it and hissing. No, not hissing, that's a lie. It wasn't hot. It just sat there on the brass like a bead. "What is it?" I said. She didn't jump. She said without looking up, "It's a valve." "For what?" And she went still, just for a second, and then she said, "You want to see or you want to talk?" She wiped her hands on her skirt and got the ledger. Now I'm no engineer. I want that understood. What she showed me, I only half followed then, and I've had 30 years to read up on it since, so if I explain it too well, that's hindsight and you should discount it. But it was a drawing of a thing that looked like a piece of pipe with 2 lungs. "It's a ram," she said, "a hydraulic ram." "A ram." "You run water downhill through a pipe." Her finger on the drawing and her voice went somewhere else, went young. This was her father's voice coming out of her. "I'd bet the ranch on it. Water gets moving. Then you slam a valve shut. All that moving water's got nowhere to go, and it doesn't just stop, it shoves. Water's not like a horse, it can't rear up. It shoves. and that shove is worth 10 times the fall. So you let the shove open a second valve, into a chamber with air in it, and the air squeezes, and when the air pushes back. She looked up at me, mud-brown eyes, a chip out of one front tooth I'd never noticed. It sends a little bit of that water up, higher than it came from, 20 times higher if you build it right, and then the whole thing starts over. Slam, shove, lift, slam, shove, lift, forever. Forever, I said. There's no engine in it. She said it like a confession. No coal, no fire, nothing to feed. It runs on the water's own falling. Papa said it's the closest thing to grace a man's allowed to build. I stood there in the doorway of a blacksmith's shop in the driest year that country ever had, and a girl in a lye-burned dress told me she could make water climb a hill for nothing. And I did what any sensible man does when he's handed a miracle. I asked her why nobody done it. They have, she said. In France, in England, there's some in Ohio. She closed the ledger. There's none here, and here's where the water's got to climb. Then why? I stopped. I'd been about to ask why she wasn't rich. She answered it anyway. It needs a fall, she said. 6 foot, 10 foot, it doesn't have to be much, but it has to be running. Living water moving above the place you want it. She looked out the door at that valley, at 11 miles of dead grass under a sky with no more mercy in it than a griddle. Papa never saw this country. He drew it for Illinois. The Apache came to the stock tank in September. 3 of them on foot, in the blue dark before moonrise. I want to tell you how it happened without any of the dime novel foolishness, because the dime novel foolishness has done enough damage. They were starving. That's it. That's the whole of it. 2 men and a boy. Their clothes were the same white cotton and calico anybody wore, and one of them had on a cavalry blouse with the buttons gone, and their moccasins were worn to nothing, and they were at the stock tank because it had water in it, and there is not one thing more complicated than that going on. I was on night watch because Merrick had lost cattle to somebody and thought it was Apache, and it was almost certainly Mexicans out of Fronteras, but reason had gone out of that country like water out of a cracked jug. I had a rifle. I had it up. My hands were shaking so hard the barrel was drawing figure eights in the dark, and I remember being ashamed of that, being ashamed, as if there were a right way to feel about aiming a gun at a boy. And Nell Hark walked out of the shed with a bucket. Not brave. I want to be precise. She wasn't brave, she was furious. I could see it in the set of her shoulders even in that light, the same set she'd had when I told her to drop the box. She walked past me and past my rifle, close enough that the barrel touched her sleeve, and she said one word to me out of the side of her mouth. She said, "Don't." She went to the tank. The 3 of them had frozen the way animals do. All of them turned to her at once, and the boy had a hand on the older man's arm. She dipped the bucket. She carried it to them. She set it down at a distance that was, I understood later, a very carefully chosen distance, close enough to be a gift, far enough to be a choice, and she stepped back and put her ruined hands behind her. Nobody drank for what felt like a year. Then the boy came forward and drank, and gave it to the older one, and the older one drank and looked at her over the rim of the bucket the whole time. His name, I'd learn, was Nante. He was maybe 50. He had a face like a piece of the country. The boy they called Pete at the agency and something else at home, and he had 4 years of mission school in him and a mouth on him like a school teacher's. Nante said something. Pete translated. Pete said, "He asks what you want." Nell said, "Nothing." Pete told him. Nante laughed one short breath through the nose, no humor in it at all, and said something else, and Pete hesitated, and Nell said, "Say it." Pete said, "He says, everyone wants something. The ones who say nothing want the most." And Nell Hark stood there with her hands behind her back and said, "Then tell him I want to know where there's running water." They came back. Not right away, twice more in 3 weeks. And always at night, and always I was on watch, and after the second time I stopped picking up the rifle at all, which is its own kind of decision, and I'm not going to pretend it was a small one. If Merrick had known, he'd have hung me. I mean that literally. There was a man in Wilcox that year who was beaten near to death for selling flour to an Apache woman. I wrote it in the book, risk hanging, value received. Blank always blank. Here's what happened those nights. Nante's group was 7 people. 4 of them were women and children camped somewhere up in the Dragoons where I never went and never asked. They were not with Geronimo. They had been at San Carlos and they had left San Carlos in the spring for reasons that Pete explained to me once in a flat voice, the way you'd read a list, and the reasons were the ration, the water, a man named Dawes who ran the beef issue and whose scale was rigged, and a baby who died. They were technically hostiles. There was technically a bounty. Nell fixed things for them. That's how it started. Nante had a rifle with a cracked stock and she splinted it with a strip of iron she cut and drilled and countersunk. And it was such a beautiful piece of work that Price the smith, who found the drill press moved a half-inch, spent a week trying to figure out which of the hands had that kind of hand. She fixed a coffee mill. She fixed the boy's knife. She rebuilt a bit for a horse. And she asked, every single time, about water. Nante wouldn't say. For a month he wouldn't say, and I understood him. I'd have been the same. You don't tell a white person where your water is. That is the single most dangerous piece of information you own, in a country where every dry year makes every white man an inch more willing to kill you. Then in October the boy got sick. I don't know what it was. Fever. He was 10. Nell sat up with him 2 nights in the shed with the door barred and Merrick's men playing cards 40 yards away, and she went through her father's box and there was nothing in it. Of course there was nothing in it. It was a box of tools. You cannot file a fever down, and I have never in my life seen a person look at their own hands with such hatred. He lived. And on the 3rd night Nante sat outside the shed in the dark with his back against the wall, and he talked for a long time, and Pete, horse, translated. He said there was a place 3 miles up in the rocks where a spring came out of a cliff and fell. He said it fell about the height of 2 men. He said it had never gone dry, not in his father's life or his father's father's. He said it ran down into a crack in the rock and disappeared into the ground and came out nowhere and had watered nothing but a few trees and his people for longer than anyone could count. And he said, if you tell them where it is, they will put a fence around it and we will die. I watched Nell Hark's face while Pete said that. She'd been holding the ledger. Her thumb was rubbing the canvas cover back and forth, the way she did. And she said, I know. Now I have to tell you about Lieutenant Ostrander. He came to Bitter Sink in the first week of November with 11 men and a pack of Apache scouts, because that's the joke nobody in the papers ever got, that the army caught Apache with Apache, that half the men hunting Geronimo were his own cousins, and he was 26 years old and he had a good face. That's what makes it hard. He wasn't a villain. He was a young man from Ohio who wanted to do his job well and go home and be told he'd done it well. He sat in Merrick's parlor with a cup of real coffee and he explained to Merrick and to 2 other ranchers and to me, because I happened to be there, that the whole business was very nearly over. Geronimo had come in, signed in September in Skeleton Canyon. It was done. But there are strays, Ostrander said, small parties off the reservation. Merrick said, in my hills. Possibly. They're taking my cattle. Possibly, Ostrander turned his cup. Mr. Merrick, do you know why we've never been able to hold them? It's not their fighting, it's water. They know every seep in 300 miles and we know 6. A man can't be caught who can drink where you die. He set down the cup. So my orders are, find the water, post the water, then they come to us. Post the water. 2 words, said pleasantly over coffee by a decent young man. I had my tally book in my coat pocket, and I did not take it out, because my hand wasn't steady enough to write. Then Ostrander said, I'm told you have a woman here who's some kind of engineer. Merrick sent for her. She came in with her hands still red from the wash and stood on the good rug, and Ostrander stood up, because he was a gentleman, and Merrick did not, because he wasn't. Ostrander was courteous, that's the thing, he was so courteous. He said he'd heard she understood water, understood how it moved through rock. He said the army would pay, actually pay, a wage, a real wage, $75, more money than she'd see in 7 months of laundry, for a survey of the springs in the Eastern Dragoons. He said she'd be given a horse and an escort. He said, and he meant it, that he thought it was a shame such a mind was wasted on a washtub. And Merrick, who had watched all this with his eyes half-lidded, said, "And when she's done, Lieutenant, I'll want to look at that survey myself. Man's got to know where his water is." Ostrander said something about that being between Mr. Merrick and the department. But you could see it. Everybody in that room could see it. The survey would go to the Army, and the Army would post the springs, and then the Army would go home to Ohio, and the springs would still be on the map, and the map would be in a drawer in Tucson, and men like Merrick would file on that land, and there would be a fence, and there would be a gate, and the gate would have a lock. Nell Hark stood on that rug with her red hands folded. She said, "How long have I got to think?" Ostrander was surprised. He said, "Miss Hark, you understand this is $75. I heard you. For a fortnight's work." "I heard you," she said again, and something in her voice made him stop. And then she said the thing that broke my heart in half, and I didn't even understand why at the time. She said, "Would the Army have any use for a pump?" Ostrander left. Merrick went to bed. I found her out behind the cookhouse at midnight, sitting on her father's box with her arms around her knees. There was a moon that night, a hard white one. She had the ledger open on her lap, and I could see the drawing on it, the pipe with 2 lungs, and all around the drawing in the margins, in a small ruined hand that was not her father's, were numbers, column after column. She'd been doing it for weeks. Head, fall, pipe diameter, delivery per minute. She'd worked out how much water Merrick's tank needed. She'd worked out how much water 11 miles of dying grass needed. She'd worked out, and this is the part that I only saw when I leaned in close, she'd worked out how much water 7 people needed. 2 men, 4 women, 1 boy. She had written it in a corner and boxed it. She'd been building it in her head all along. In the lie, in the steam, in the dark. "Hollies," she said. She'd never used my name before. "Yeah. If I tell them where it is, they get water for that valley." She said it very evenly, like she'd said it to herself 100 times and had worn all the feeling off the words the way water wears a stone. "Merrick's cattle live. The Kesslers live there at Tres Alamos. Did you know that? They made it. They've got a claim. Everybody on that flat lives. Everybody who comes after lives. That's Hollies. That's 100 years of people. And if you don't—" She was quiet. "If I don't," she said, "then the only thing I ever build in my life, I build for 7 people in a rock, and it stays a secret, and it dies with them. And my father drew it for the world." The wind came up off the flat, and it smelled like dust and cold creosote, and it moved her hair. He said grace, Hollies. He said it was the closest thing to grace a man's allowed to build. She looked at her hands, turned them over. "So how is it that either way I do it, I'm buying somebody's water with somebody else's?" I did not have an answer. I have had 30 years, and I do not have an answer. What I did was take out my tally book, because it is the only thing I know how to do, and I opened it to a clean page, and I held it out to her with the pencil. "What's that for?" she said. "You put down what a thing costs," I said. My voice came out strange. "Both columns, and then you look at it, and then you know." She took it. She looked at the blank page a long time. Then she wrote. I saw her write it, 2 words at the top of the left-hand column. She wrote the price. And she sat there with the pencil not moving, and the moon went behind a cloud the size of a hand, the first cloud anybody had seen in that country since June, and neither of us said anything about it. And after a while she closed the book without writing another word and gave it back to me and stood up and went and got her father's box. "Where are you going?" I said. She got it up on her shoulder, one hand on the rope, the way she carried it. The spring was where he said it was, and it was nothing. That's what I remember. After all that, after the weeks of hiding and the whispering and the rifle I stopped picking up, we came around a shoulder of rock at first light, and there it was, and it was a wet stain on a cliff face. Water came out of a seam about the height of my hat above the ground, and it fell maybe 12 feet into a basin worn smooth as a soup bowl, and it made a sound like somebody quietly clearing their throat. Sycamores around it, 4 of them, going yellow. Grass. A ring of black stones where people had cooked for probably 1,000 years. That's all. You could have covered the whole of it with a bedsheet. Nell Hark stood at the edge of the basin and looked at it for a long time, and then she sat down on a rock and put her face in her hands, and Nante and I traded a look, because neither one of us knew if she was crying. She wasn't. When she came up, her eyes were dry and burning. 11 feet, she said. Maybe 12, it's enough. Here is what I have never been able to explain to anybody who asks about her. Everybody wants the story where the girl is a genius, where she sees the thing whole in a flash and builds it, and the water comes up and everyone cheers. What I watched was 6 weeks of a person being wrong. She was wrong about the fall. She measured it 4 times with a knotted string and a stone and got 4 different numbers before she made a plumb bob out of a musket ball and got the same number twice. She was wrong about the basin. The sand in it was 10 inches deep, and she had to dig it out with a flat rock because there was no shovel. And she found the bottom was cracked and losing water, and she had to puddle it with clay from a bank a half-mile off, carried in her skirt, 11 trips. She was wrong about the pipe. The pipe is where the whole thing nearly died. A ram needs a drive pipe. Long, straight, and rigid. It has to be iron or the shove goes into flexing the pipe instead of lifting the water. She needed 60 feet of it, and Bitter Sink had none, and Tucson had it at a price that made my teeth ache, and there was no wagon going to Tucson. Except there was. I want this written down plainly, because I have spent 30 years not saying it out loud. In the 3rd week of November, I hauled a load for the Merrick outfit from the railhead at Bowie. Barbed wire, coal oil, 6 kegs of nails, and 120 feet of 2-inch galvanized pipe intended for the extension of Merrick's east well casing. 60 feet of that pipe never reached Bitter Sink. I unloaded it in the dark 2 miles up a side canyon and covered it with brush and told Merrick's foreman that the shipment had come up short. And he wrote to the freight agent in Bowie, and the freight agent wrote back that it had not, and for about 10 days I believed I was going to be hanged. I wrote it in the tally book. I'm looking at the page now, or I could be if I got up, and I know exactly what it says, because I have read it more times than I have read scripture. Pipe 2 in, Galv 60 FD, stolen, value $41.20. Risk, employment, reputation, neck. Value received. That dash. I've filled in blanks all my life. I put down what a coffin cost. I have never in this world figured out how to price what I got for that pipe, and I have come to think that the not knowing is the answer, and that my whole book is a monument to a question I asked wrong. She built it in a canyon 3 miles from where any white man had business being, with the boy Pete holding the other end of everything. Nante wouldn't touch it. He came, he sat, he watched. He was letting a white woman put iron in his water, and he had made that decision the way a man decides to have his leg taken off, and he was not going to help. But he watched. And on the 4th day, when she couldn't hold the pipe and swing the maul at the same time, he stood up and held the pipe and said nothing and went and sat back down after, and never once acknowledged that he had moved. Pete was different. Pete was 10 and he was on fire. She taught him, that's the thing that gets lost. There was no time, the whole business was hurry, hide, hurry, and she taught him anyway. She would not let him just hold a thing. She made him understand why he was holding it. He learned to read the spirit level. He learned to cut a thread with a die and curse it like a mule skinner when it seized, and she laughed at him for the first time in front of me, and it changed her whole face. He asked her once why the water in the tube didn't just fall back down. She said, because the air won't let it. And Pete said, air's not strong. And Nell said, everything you can't see is strong. The pieces came together like this, and I have this from her ledger, which I still have, because she gave it to me, and I'll get to that. A drive pipe, our stolen 60 feet, laid on a slope from the basin down the canyon, on a fall of 11 feet 3 inches. At the bottom, a valve box built of the mesquite planks off a wrecked chuck wagon, waterproofed with tallow and tar. Inside it, 2 valves. The first, the waste valve, the slam valve, the heart of the thing, was a disc she cut from the brass of a steam whistle and faced with a leather washer cut from her own shoe. It sat open and let the water run, and when the water got moving fast enough, its own rush snatched that disc up and slammed it shut, and that was the sound. Honk, like an axe going into wet wood. And with nowhere to go, the water shoved. 60 feet of moving water putting its whole weight against a closed door. The second valve, the one I'd watched her file by candlelight, 100 miles and a lifetime ago, opened under that shove, and the water went up through it into the air chamber. The air chamber was an old cavalry powder keg, iron-bound, that Pete stole out of a rubbish pit at the agency and carried 9 miles on his back. The air in that keg squeezed, and when it pushed back, it drove a thin standing column of water up the delivery pipe, and the delivery pipe was a thing she made out of every scrap of iron and lead and hollowed sycamore in that country, joined in 71 places, buried in a trench she and Pete dug with 2 flat rocks and a broken bayonet, running down and out of that canyon, and under the crack where the spring had always disappeared into the ground. And then it ran on, underground for 2.5 miles. And then it came up. It came up in the middle of the flat, out of a bare patch of dirt 11 miles from any mountain, in a place where nothing had ever grown but greasewood, and where Silas Merrick's dying cattle walked their slow circles. That was the whole idea. That was the thing she'd been building behind her eyes since the night she asked me for a page in my book. Don't tell them where the water is, bring it to them. Give the valley the water, and give the mountain nothing to want. It didn't work. 6 weeks of work, and it ran for 11 minutes. I was there. It started, and I will hear that sound in whatever comes after this life. Hawk, hawk, hawk. Slow, steady, about once a second, like a big animal's heart, and the pipe hummed, and Pete ran down the line hollering with his hands on the buried iron to feel it move. And then the hawks came faster and faster, and went to a rattle and stopped. Silence in that canyon, just the little throat clearing of the spring, doing what it had done for 1,000 years, going nowhere. Nell Hark stood there with a hand on the valve box. The air's gone, she said. Pete said, how can air go? Into the water, she said it in a dead voice. It dissolves. Every stroke it takes a little. Chamber fills up solid and there's no spring left in it and it beats itself apart. She sat down in the wet gravel with her arms around her knees, and this is the part that I will fight anybody who wants to leave it out. She sat there for 2 hours, not thinking, not working. She sat with her chin on her knees and her eyes open and nothing behind them, and she said once, so quietly that I don't believe she knew she'd said it, "Papa, Papa, what did you leave out?" Because he had. Amos Hark's drawing in that ledger is beautiful and it is incomplete. Whether he knew the answer and never wrote it, whether he'd have told her in a shed in Illinois in 1 sentence over a cup of coffee if he had lived 4 more years, that's a door that's shut. She had a dead man's drawing and a dead man's tools and no dead man. She got up at dusk. Her face was terrible. She took the box off her shoulder and she opened it, and she took out the scribing awl, and she went to the drive pipe 6 inches back from the valve box, and she punched a hole in Silas Merrick's stolen pipe. A hole in the pipe, on purpose. Pete made a sound like she'd cut him. And she knelt in the gravel and cut a flap of leather out of what was left of her shoe and tacked it over that hole so it could open in and not out, and she said, not to us, "It sucks." After the slam, there's a half beat where it sucks. I said, "Nell." "Air," she said. "It'll pull air, every stroke, right back into the chamber." She looked up at Pete, not at me, at Pete. "Everything you can't see is strong. It'll drink air like a horse." It ran 3 days later. It ran that night, and the next day, and the day after, and it was still running 11 minutes past that, and an hour past that, and Pete lay flat on his stomach on the buried delivery line with his ear to the dirt, and I stood there with my hat in my hands like a man in a church. 2.5 miles away, out on the flat, water came up out of the ground. Not a gush, a pulse, a little rise and fall in a spreading pool once a second forever, the way a vein moves in a wrist. The cattle found it before the men did. That's how Merrick came to know. His riders found 400 head standing in mud on a flat that had been bone dry since Coolidge was a boy, and they came galloping in to say the ground had opened. Merrick rode out to look at it, and he stood there, and he got down off his horse and squatted and put his hand in the water. And I stood there next to him, and I told him the lie. Nell and I had built it together, the two of us, sitting on a wagon tongue on a cold night. Artesian. An artesian rise. There was a whole vocabulary for it in the papers that year. Kansas was full of it, pressure trapped in a rock bed, water climbing on its own. Nobody in that country understood it, which is exactly why everybody believed it. We had her put a little iron cap on the outlet with a broken nipple in it so it would look like something old, something the earth did. Merrick knelt in the mud in a $200 coat with his hand in the water, and he laughed. I'd never heard it. It was a bad sound. He said, "Do you know what this is worth?" And I said, "No, sir, I don't." And it was the truest thing I said in the whole of 1886. Ostrander came back in December for his survey. Nell Hark met him in the yard, and she had a rolled paper under her arm, and she was wearing shoes with no leather in the left toe. She gave him the survey. It was real work, 3 weeks of it, done in the evenings, honest and careful and correct, every seep and tank and tanaja in the Eastern Dragoons, drawn to scale in a hand that would have gotten her a job anywhere on earth if she'd been born a man. 11 Springs. Not the 12th. I watched her hand it to him. I watched her face. And what was on it was not triumph. It was the look of a woman handing over 11 springs, 11 places where people who were not her people had been drinking for 1,000 years, 11 gates that would have locks on them inside of 3 years. Because she needed to hand over something, because a survey with nothing in it is a confession. She took the $75. She had to. It would have been a scream to refuse it. She walked away from the parlor with the money in her fist, and she got about 40 feet and stopped and stood absolutely still with her back to us. And Ostrander said, kindly, "Miss Hark, are you unwell?" And she said, "Yes," and kept walking. She gave every cent of it to Nantes women, in blankets and flour and a wool coat for the boy, over 3 trips at night. She kept nothing. I know because I hauled it and I watched her count it out, and I wrote it in my book with a hand I couldn't hold steady. $75, $11 springs, wrecked in full. They took them at Bowie Station on the 9th of January. Not because of the survey, not because of the pipe or the pump or anything Nell Hark did or didn't do. I want that understood, and I want it understood slowly, because it is the whole and entire meaning of everything I've told you, and it took me 20 years to get my arms around it. By then the war was over. It had been over since September. And what the government did when it was over was gather up every Chiricahua Apache in the territory and put them on a train and send them to Florida. Every one. The ones who fought and the ones who'd never fought, and the women and the children out of the school. And this is the part that I have never been able to make anybody believe. So I just say it flat and let them believe it or not, the scouts. The Apache men who had spent 2 years in the field hunting Geronimo for the United States Army, who wore the uniform, who had that army's own medals on them. They put those men on the same train. Nantes 7 came in on their own. They came in because there was nowhere left to be. Pete told me he found me on the road. The boy walked 11 miles to find me. He said Nantes said the water changed it. He said Nantes said, now there is a thing here that will still be alive when we are not, and it will belong to no one, and it will not know whose it is, and that is the only way anything survives in this country. I don't know if that's what he said. I know it's what a 10-year-old boy told a freighter on a cold road, in his second language with his hands shaking. They marched them onto the cars at Bowie Station. There's a photograph of it. You may have seen it. People stood on the platform and looked at them. Nell Hark was on that platform. She had the box on her shoulder. She'd walked all night. She got to about 15 feet from the cars, and a corporal put a hand on her and she stopped. And she found Pete's face in the window. And the two of them looked at each other for however long it takes to load a train. She didn't shout anything. She didn't wave. She took the box off her shoulder and she held it up. Both arms. Over her head, that oak box, heavier than her own good sense, with the brass plate on it, Hark. And she held it up so he could see it, and she stood there like that until her arms gave out. And that's all. That's the whole goodbye. That's what she got. Merrick sold the water. Of course he did. What did anybody think was going to happen? He fenced the flat. He built a stone tank around the outlet. I hauled the stone, and he charged the Kesslers and everybody else on that side of the valley $3 a month for their stock to drink. And inside of 2 years Bitter Sink was the biggest outfit between the Chiricahuas and the San Pedro, and Silas Merrick was on the Territorial Board of Trade. And in the spring of 1888, a hydraulic engineer named Whitlock came out from Baltimore, because the artesian story had gotten into a journal, and he was up in that canyon inside of a week. Because you cannot hide a 2.5-mile buried pipe from a man who is looking for a 2.5-mile buried pipe. He found the ram, hocking away in its mesquite box in the cold, once a second keeping time. He wrote a paper about it. I've read it. It's in a bound volume in the library at the normal school in Tempe, and I have driven 90 miles to read it more than once, and I could recite the relevant sentence to you, but I'd rather just tell you what it says, which is that the installation displayed an unusually well-formed snifter arrangement and an air chamber of improvised but effective construction, and that the ram had evidently been in continuous operation for some period without maintenance. Without maintenance, she hadn't been near it in a year and a half. And the paper credits the design to the proprietor of the Bitter Sink Ranch. Not by name, it says the proprietor, and Merrick never once in his life said the word no when somebody thanked him for it. There's a catalog. Sears had it and then a firm in Chicago. It ran for 30 years. It is a very good design, and the snifter valve on it is a leather flap over a punched hole 6 inches back from the valve box, and it works and it works, and it is still working right now, this minute in that canyon, and in about 2,000 other canyons, and it is called Merrick's perpetual water engine. I want to be fair to the dead. I don't believe Silas Merrick ever quite lied about it. I believe he simply let a true thing about a woman go unsaid until enough time passed that it became, for practical purposes, untrue. That's how it's always done. Nobody has to lie, you just have to be quiet long enough. She came to me the night before she left, February, cold enough that the horses were steaming. She'd been washing clothes for 8 more weeks. She could have walked out the day after the train, and she didn't. And I never asked why, and I think it was because she wanted to be able to look at the water. I think she went out on that flat at night and watched it pulse. She had the box. She put it down between us and she opened it and she took out the spirit level, brass and mahogany, and she held it flat on her palm and we both watched the green bubble come to the middle and tremble and settle. She said it's the only honest tool in the box. She said everything else you can force. You can make a bad cut and file it true. This one just tells you what is. And she gave me the ledger. I said I couldn't take it. She said it was no use to her. She had it by heart. And anyway, I was the one with the sickness for writing things down. I said, where will you go? She got the box up on her shoulder, one hand on the rope. The way she carried it, the way she'd carried it out of a flood. East, she said. I said, how far east? And she looked at me, and there was a little chip out of one front tooth. And she did not answer me, and she smiled. I'd seen her smile exactly twice. And she said, Hollies, you know what it costs to get to Florida? I said no. She said, neither do I yet. I never saw her again. Nobody did that I've found and I have looked. There's no Hark on the passenger lists. There's no Hark in the Fort Marion records, or Mount Vernon barracks, or the school at Carlisle where they sent the children. And I've written to all of them over the years, and gotten back kind letters from people who had never heard of her and had no reason to. 27 years after Bowie Station, they let the Chiricahua go. Some went to Oklahoma. Some went home to Mescalero in New Mexico, which is not their home but is closer to it than Florida. In 1924, a man came through Wilcox looking for a freighter named Hollies. He was in his 40s, gray already. He had a good coat and a bad cough and hands that were burned across the backs the way a man's are who has worked at a forge for 25 years. We sat on the loading dock. I could not stop looking at him. He talked about the railroad where he'd worked, and about the pump house at the school where he'd worked before that, and about his daughter who was studying to be a teacher. I asked him what I had waited 38 years to ask. He said no. He said no woman ever came. He said he'd watched for one at Fort Marion for about 3 years on the wall at the same hour, and then he stopped watching, and he said that was the year he understood something about the country he was in. Then he was quiet a while, and he said, I have wondered if she got as far as the coast. And I said, she'd have gotten as far as she could get. And he said, yes. And neither one of us said anything else about it, because there wasn't anything else, and we sat there and watched a switch engine work. Before he left, he asked if I'd ever seen the pump. I said I saw it built. And he held up his hands, those scarred hands, and turned them over, and he said, she showed me how to true a valve seat. Everything I have ever eaten in my life, I ate because of 1 hour in a canyon. I am 81 years old, and I have kept a book of what things cost for 62 years. There are 4,000 entries in it, hats and horses and doctors, a wife, a pipe I stole, every one of them has a number. There is a page in the middle from November of 1886 that is blank except for 2 words at the top of the left-hand column, written in a hand that was not mine, by a girl who wrote them and then set the pencil down. The price. I have carried that book across 60 years of country, and I have never once been able to write anything under it. Not the pipe, not the 11 springs, not the boy in the window, not the sound of that thing running in the dark, once a second, faithful, indifferent, still running, going to run long after every person in this account is dust, pulling breath through a hole she punched with her father's awl. Everything you can't see is strong. I think of her on that platform, with her arms over her head. I think about how the water in that valley has never known whose it is. And I think, God help me, I have thought this for 38 years, and I have never once said it out loud. And I am saying it now because there's nobody left it can hurt. That she asked me for the page. She asked me for the page, and I gave it to her, and she looked at it and she gave it back. And I have spent my whole life believing that meant she couldn't find the number. But she was the best hand at reckoning I ever knew. She could figure a fall to the 16th of an inch by moonlight. So it has come to me, lately in the nights, that maybe she found it just fine. Maybe she looked at that page and did the sum, and the sum came out, and what she saw was that it was payable, and that she was the one holding it, and that it was